Hey, Skiff listeners, hear about the latest trends in the travel industry with the Brand USA Talks Travel podcast. Right now, listen to special live from IPW interviews featuring U.S. Travel's Jeff Freeman.
DMOs are at the heartbeat of U.S. travel.
Liz Bittner from Travel South.
A lot of key gateway markets are back.
LA Tourism's Adam Burke.
We all win when we all partner together.
Plus, Brand USA's Stacey Melman and Jackie Ennis with international travel trends and Chris Thompson's farewell finale. I'm Mark Lapidus. Join us for Brand USA Talks Travel on your favorite podcast platform.
Brand USA Talks Travel.
You're listening to the Skift podcast. In this episode, Skift founder and CEO Rafid Ali is joined by Michael O'Regan, PhD, a lecturer at Glasgow Caledonian University, focused on tourism and the events industry. They discuss the impact of over-tourism on destinations, how the concept has perhaps become outdated in the post-COVID era, and more sustainable approaches to tourism management. The conversation also touches on questions of bias towards visitors from certain regions and what exactly constitutes a quote-unquote quality tourist. For more like this and the latest news in travel, visit skift.com.
Well, welcome to another edition of the Skift podcast. I'm so glad to have Michael O'Regan, who's a PhD and a lecturer at Glasgow Caledonian University, focused on tourism and the events industry. He's had a great career in the tourism industry in the UK and Ireland. Was it UK or Ireland?
I'm Irish, and I've worked in the industry there, got my primary education there, but then moved to the UK for my PhD.
And then you've been at a few universities, including China as well, where you were there for, you said, 4 years?
That's correct, yes. I worked in industry for a couple of years, working basically pre-Expedia or pre-Booking.com. We were doing the accommodation bookings for the Irish Tourist Board, and we were taking information calls from around the world, for Irish tourist brochures, etc. Then moved on to marketing executive for an area so south of Dublin, the capital. As a marketing executive, we call it, miniature Ireland, lots of beaches and mountains. Mm-hmm. I did the PhD in backpacking, how people become backpackers, as in low-budget travelers. And then decided to teach in China for 4 years. Well, it was an overseas UK campus, so it wasn't as strange or as different as people might maybe think, but really enjoyed 4 years there before coming back to the UK as an academic here.
So the reason I wanted you on the podcast is that you came out with academic. Would you call it a paper? Or was it a pre-paper? Because it's not technically a actual academic paper. Well, what would you describe it as?
Well, I've written 2 academic papers on this word or phrase, over-tourism, and there is a current piece of research that I'm doing, looking at how newspapers cover the phrase, and also looking at how academic papers have been looking at the phrase over the last 3 or 4 years. Okay. So from that, some initial thoughts, some initial findings came out about how journalists, have built narratives around the phrase and the metaphors they link with over-tourism as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I came across your piece on the Tourism Geography's website, and describe for those of the people who don't know, what is Tourism Geographies?
Well, basically, it's linked to the Royal Geographic Society in the UK. It's like the American Geography Association. It's a big, charity or non-profit that represents kind of the discipline or the subject area of geography in all its varied subject areas, from cultural to physical. And basically, as in UK academia, it's important that we reach out to the public, and we engage people with our ideas. Mm-hmm. So basically, it's bringing those ideas that we're working on, that we're developing papers on, that we're analyzing research on, and bringing that out to the public, so we, the public can engage with those ideas. Not just the public, but again, students across third level, but also secondary level or high school students as well.
Okay, so you wrote this post on why you think over-tourism is a outdated construct post-COVID, particularly, or in general, is now an outdated construct. And surprise, surprise, I agreed with you on it also on LinkedIn. And the genesis of why we're having conversation is Skift coined the term over-tourism back in 2016 in a what became a seminal piece for us on Iceland. It was a deep dive. One of our reporters went to Iceland, had been doing research from before that, and wrote this very long piece on Iceland as a mirror to the challenges of managing tourism. Managing too much tourism in a destination, and this is particularly was concentrated in Iceland because after the volcano, it became very popular as a place to go, and suddenly the whole country reoriented from a very primarily fishing economy, marine, and then banking emerged during the financial crisis that happened after, and then became a tourist-based economy, and it continues to be now. And so we coined the term over-tourism as a way to introduce, one, that piece, and two, as a way to spur the debate beyond the previous. There have been decades of work on sustainable tourism as a concept, but very much appealing to the altruistic side of the industry, which we can talk about, hadn't necessarily broken through as a concept to the industry. And the reason we created the term was to appeal to the fears of too much tourism for destinations, for countries, for certainly was benefiting obviously the industry quite a bit in terms of just the volume of tourists. So that was the construct. It wasn't meant to be either a framework to manage tourism, but certainly the aim was not to demonize tourists, but the aim was to have the tourist boards and countries and regions and governments wake up to the challenges and manage it. So explain in this, what was your thesis with this post that you wrote recently?
Well, congratulations. It was a great phrase, a great term, and so many people around the world and so many different groups of people from the European Parliament, UNWTO, United Nations World Tourism Organization, journalists, consultants, did grasp on to this phrase and this word. And one of my previous papers looked at how over-tourism was used on Twitter, and again how it grew from not being used at all as a hashtag, and then culminating in 5,000 plus tweets in 2019. So I understand why it was used, and I understand why people grasped onto it, because people were feeling, or at least some people were feeling in destinations that there were problems with tourism or too many tourists, and they wanted to express that in their own way. And the problem was it became used for very different reasons by very different groups of people who built narratives around it and built crisis narratives around it. Mm-hmm. And within 2 years of Skift coining the phrase or the term, it had exploded from not just a problem but into a crisis, and not just a crisis in Iceland, but a crisis across the whole globe. Right. And by some accounts, if you were to look at let's say the newspaper articles, and I'm currently exploring how many destinations had been linked with over-tourism, but there's something like 70 or 80 destinations around the world, massive cities, big global cities like Barcelona, all the way down to small rural towns, heritage attractions, down to local markets, and then we use these phrases around that, that destinations are suffering, or that we're being plagued by tourists, and that there was a flood of tourists. So the way we use metaphors to describe over-tourism is problematic, and we probably use metaphors, and it's not just journalists, it's academics, it's consultants, politicians, it's politicians who are using these metaphors as well. And we would use it to describe tourists as being the problem or the source problem of over-tourism. And we applied these metaphors, and some of them are pretty ugly metaphors, swarms of tourists or plagues of tourists, in ways that we would never describe any other mobile grouping. whether it be business people or whether it be commuters or whether it be, any other group that moves from place to place for any particular reason. And that has an impact. If you treat this group of people as a threat, then the next step is you need a solution to the threat. And again, you're trying to direct, maybe these metaphors towards policymakers, to institutions. And it did have an impact. You did have lots of local mayors and politicians saying, okay, we agree that over-tourism exists. We agree that tourists are the problem. So, what do we need to do? We need to fine tourists for eating a sandwich on a
beach or something. Yeah.
Or we need to put up CCTV cameras, or we need to track them, or we need to filter out the good ones from the bad ones, the high quality from the low quality.
Right.
So I think that led to a lot of issues, especially once it started impacting policy making and started impacting, the way politicians talk about tourism.
And you've spent time in China quite a bit, and it looked like are still connected to the region quite a bit. Chinese tours became a focus of this, unfortunately, in negative ways, whether it was incidents in Paris. I remember we were covering, this is pre-COVID, about how almost racism, if you will, against Chinese tourists in other parts of Europe as well, some parts of Southeast Asia. So from your perspective, does the when the Westerners were traveling into East for decades, nobody had an issue. It's when Easterners started coming to West that we suddenly started having an issue. So do you think there's an undercurrent of that as well?
There is an undercurrent of that. It wasn't very explicit, but, some journalists were, in the same paragraph or the next paragraph talking about specific nationalities, primarily the Chinese, and primarily when they're moving in tour groups or packages, as to being, one of the source countries for, over-tourism. And, and it's, if you look back at, tourism history, as we do it at this university, we've seen the same thing happen with Russia when they emerged after, of course, Glasnost and the opening up. Same thing happened, and the same thing when Japan in the 80s started outbound.
Right, the camera, they had the big cameras, and I remember, at least growing up, I wasn't in the travel industry, but I remember stories around Japanese tourists really see the world through their cameras versus actually looking at. So this was way before mobile phone became a thing.
Exactly. Yeah, it was like how can we deal with these specific tourists and what they're leading to particular specific problems, and the same with the Russians, and it's emerging and within as India outbound travel, you can see some of the same discourses and narratives starting out there, and that that's another piece of research I'm looking at because of course as an emerging country as a and as tourism as a kind of soft power outlet, Chinese authorities have been very sensitive to criticism of their tourists. They've been doing a lot to develop, educational booklets, and we were showing these booklets because they're published by the Chinese Tourist Board to give to outbound tourists.
Yeah, I remember that.
As to, what do they feel about, having, these brochures printed, and they don't really recognize themselves in those brochures. And if you're looking at, statistically in terms of their, the issues with, I suppose, air rage and issues on flights, it's primarily coming from, countries like the UK and, because we allow alcohol sales, pre-flights, and the States, where there's daily issues with air rage. And
it certainly happened over the pandemic where people were with the masks and everything else that also collided with that.
Hey, Skiff listeners, hear about the latest trends in the travel industry with the Brand USA Talks Travel podcast. Right now, listen to special live from IPW interviews featuring U.S. Travel's Jeff Freeman.
DMOs are at the heartbeat of U.S. travel.
Liz Bittner from Travel South.
A lot of key gateway markets are back.
LA Tourism's Adam Burke.
We all win when we all partner together.
Plus, Brand USA's Stacey Melman and Jackie Ennis with international travel trends and Chris Thompson's farewell finale. I'm Mark Lapidus. Join us for Brand USA Talks Travel on your favorite podcast platform.
Brand USA talks travel.
So from your perspective, obviously the debate, the word over tourism and the debate and the was at its peak in 2019, I would say, 2018, 2019. And then COVID hit and obviously everything stopped. So everybody stopped talking about over tourism, at least in the mainstream media. But academics continued, because most of the research is long range versus the headlines. You and other academics were continuing your research on not just over tourism, the word, but sort of managing tourism as it came back, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. Before, the pandemic, it was cascading into something, serious, because again, journalists and academics were calling it a crisis, calling it an emergency, calling it a disaster. And there was a global phenomenon that we needed to tackle if we were to, to protect what they consider the victims of over-tourism, which is local residents,
right,
and the people who live in particular communities who are vulnerable to too many tourists. But it was being used, and there's a little bit of blame here that goes to the UNWTO by saying, well, over-tourism is anything that is negative towards local people's quality of life. But that means it could be applied to basically any place, because it's based on perceptions. It's based on perceptions of tourists lead to overcrowding or criminality or rising rents or the local shop disappearing. It could be anything. And then it would meet basically the criteria of over-tourism.
Right.
So it was being used everywhere for anything, regardless of, whether it was reality or it was just a perception based on some small sample or based on some interviews with local stakeholders who may have had a vested interest in, calling it over-tourism.
Yeah.
So 2019, it's, it was the highlight. But after that, academics are still coming to grips as to, okay, if this is not the phrase we're going to use, if this doesn't lead to a framework or methodology, what's going to replace it? How else do we talk about the issues in some destinations? And there's an increasing number of people saying, this isn't the phrase that we can use as a kind of a analytical concept. This is not how we can measure mismanagement, and it directs our attention only at tourists. It doesn't direct attention at the facilitators of tourism, at policy level, who design visa systems, the people who provide licenses at local level for bars and nightclubs, and you can see
low-cost airlines, the low-cost airlines, the proliferation of Airbnb and into neighborhoods. So a lot of complex issues beyond certainly blaming tourists for all the ills, I guess is the point you're trying to make.
Exactly. Yeah. And destinations are trying to move beyond over-tourism. And it's like Voldemort in Harry Potter. It's something now that the word has disappeared in lexicon in some institutions, or, in the language that politicians are using. They're moving on a little bit. And I think basically everyone else has to move on a little bit too, to something else.
Yeah, and that's why we're having this conversation, because I agree with you. I think the post-pandemic, and particularly we did a story right before pandemic, I'm going to say late 2019 or something, on what happens when over-tourism meets climate change, and with a pretty deep dive on what too much tourism means for climate change, and the effect that tourism generally has and it does have an extractive effect on the planet. And in pandemic, climate change, certainly in the last 2-3 years, has emerged as an emergency. Media, again, I guess, I don't know if you'll argue that media is also using some of these headlines to create more panic when it needs to have a methodical tackling of issues that underlie climate change in general. But for us, the conversation has moved beyond the grabbing the headlines to say, okay, here are the solutions. Here's why it's become climate change has entered into the debate. And here's how companies are responding, whether it's companies that are traveling for corporate travel and have their own ESG targets to reduce their own carbon footprint, to hotels and airlines. Everybody has now announced their targets 2030, 2050 in terms of carbon neutral as companies, et cetera, et cetera. So it's become a lot more nuanced, and certainly COVID did a whole reset on somewhat simplistic debate that was there before. And so I think that's why I agreed with the premise that you had in terms of, as a term, it I would say had its utility when it came, was stretched to the maximum that it could, and then I don't know if it would have been retired had COVID not sort of hit our consciousness, if you will, or came. So from your perspective, sort of post-COVID, for now it's just recovery. Like, let's just get recovery going, and that happened over the last year, 2 years, something like that. Asia is just starting now, or at least parts of Asia are starting now.
Thailand, yeah, but then we have Vietnam and other countries, and partly because we moved on to different phrases. We have this, discourse around quality tourists and how do we get quality tourists in the post-COVID recovery. And that has exactly the same problems as, over-tourism in some ways.
Thailand has been using the word quality tourist, and it says, we don't want backpackers. And you've done a PhD in backpacking, as you said. What's your sense of sort of this quest for quality tourists and what's underlying it?
Of course, it's a kind of a solution to over-tourism in some way, that instead of having mass tourists, that you would suddenly be able to pivot towards quality tourists.
And what does quality tourist even mean?
That is a good question, and different people will say different things. From New Zealand, Vietnam, they're all saying this, and they're saying, well, these quality tourists are richer. But then when you ask them, how will they get there? Well, private jets is, and how long would they stay? Well, 2 days. Where are they going to stay? Maybe a franchise hotel. That's not very quality, because again, if they're staying only for 1 or 2 nights, even just the carbon with the flight alone, and even with the food choices, even with the hotel choice, not much money is going to be staying in the economy. But if we were looking at backpackers, and backpackers have been, I suppose, scapegoated in Thailand, Vietnam, New Zealand, where they say they don't want these people anymore. I would say that they are the quality tourists in some way, if I were to use that phrase, because they stay longer, they're using public transport, they're using local restaurants, they're staying in maybe independent guest houses or homestays. So again, I had a kind of recent blog about its use. I just published a book on backpacking as being a valuable asset to any destination, whether it be a emerging destination, where destinations can slowly adapt to tourism based on smaller numbers of longer staying, backpackers. And, you mentioned Iceland at the beginning. And of course, and some people will blame Instagram and Justin Bieber and everyone else for, the explosion of tourism in Iceland. But there was, economic changes after the crash there, the economic crash, and they weren't able to adapt to, tourism, rather than plan for tourism, and particular areas of our sectors were vulnerable to too many tourists, and that's understood. So that's why, when I hear, this new phrase, quality tourists, I get a sense of deja vu again. But
what do you think of phrases, and I guess this is an academic phrase, regenerative tourism, which is a term that has emerged. It came from academia, from my understanding. Obviously, sustainable tourism as a concept has been there. You can call it responsible tourism. Then came transformative travel, which was very sort of me-centric term. That didn't come from I don't think it came from the academic. That just came from I don't know, magazines, travel magazines. And then regenerative tourism, which is give back more than you take away concept. We borrow a lot of phrases like over-tourism, and sometimes we adapt them, quite well, or we empirically prove them, or build a framework around them. Other times,
less successful. So, I understand that we need sustainable development, we need mobility and spatial justice, we need, just transitions as we move to net zero economies. But I think using some of these phrases, it kind of hides as much as we learn from these phrases. And if you were to ask different people what is regenerative tourism, just like anything else, what is ecotourism or what is
green tourism,
green tourism, or my favorite, responsible tourism, you get 10 different answers from 10 different people. But I understand, I'm in really full agreement with you and in full agreement with those people who feel that, tourism has to be managed in some way, in that it can have unintended impacts on destinations. It can decrease quality of life for those people who live in, particular destinations. But sometimes I think it just leads us to ask the wrong questions and point the fingers in the wrong direction. All the tools that we need, we already have. You mentioned some of them already in terms of tourist taxes, in terms of, airport policy, in terms of regulating short-term rentals, in terms of improving education on tourism and hospitality at local level. So, to improve the job quality, etc. Trying to reduce the exploitation around labor in hospitality, tourism, and in events, zero-hour contracts, the gig economy. And, Amsterdam are pretty good in, realizing this, that they were suffering a little bit from mismanagement at destination level. And rather than, calling for quality tourists or calling for, are proportioning blame on, particular types of tourists, maybe, that have worked to, limit licensing hours, to demarket a little bit, to...
Yeah, they're focused. Yesterday, there was a news, we're recording this in early April, and yesterday there was a news that Amsterdam, the Schiphol airport, is stopping flights at a certain time in the night. So it won't be a 24/7 operation anymore, with an idea that it improves the quality of people that are living around the airport. So certainly there's more awareness as a holistic versus just piecemeal solutions. Certainly Amsterdam has been thinking about it probably the most deeply than other cities in Europe, it looks like.
Yeah, Amsterdam was one of the first, destinations where over-tourism was, being applied, and
correct, yeah.
And so, of course, Venice as well, which is a very unique case, of course.
Correct, it's a very unique case, yeah. Yeah, Amsterdam has yeah, go ahead, sorry.
But yeah, Amsterdam, has done quite a bit to manage tourism and to, of course, to facilitate business interests, but to facilitate local people. But of course, it's a global city, and tourism does bring, changes. Some changes are for the good, some changes for the bad. And I think sometimes when we, again, go back to the new phrases, now it's about degrowth and how to reduce tourism. And again, I think, we have to be very careful around, that concept of degrowth and how we actually do it. And there's very little practical advice as to how economies should reduce consumption, and especially in the light of, real world changes. We have Saudi Arabia, it was just recently decided they're going to launch a new airline with, 400 new aircraft, or we've seen, Chinese airlines expanding rapidly as well. So, the strategies and the tools that we need to manage tourism are there. But again, it's often up to politicians to grasp the nettle and, of course, face down. In particular, of course, there are vested interests and there are particular stakeholders who don't want to put a brake or don't want to see any restriction on tourism.
Yeah.
That's equally a mistake.
Yeah. Well, it's been fascinating. I want to end with a question, a big picture question that I have, which is the role today, from your perspective, of academia in tourism industry. and maybe we focus on tourism versus the larger travel, but we can certainly talk about the larger travel. You've as you said, your career has been in the industry initially, across geographies, not just in a single geography, but multiple geographies, being at multiple universities. And so post-COVID, the state of tourism, academia, or research, and its importance, I don't want to put words in that, practical importance to the world.
It's one of the world's biggest, I suppose, industrial or economic sectors. It implies tens of millions of people around the world, many of them, starting their careers are for people who may not be able to get the education to be an engineer or to be, a scientist. And for many people who are only, beginning to explore, their potential, tourism is incredibly important in terms of employment, in terms of global understanding. I don't want to go too far, but in terms of, global peace and intercultural exchange as well, if we were to think about even things like the Cold War, from, relationships with, our neighbors. And I do worry that when we talk about tourism, and we, especially during COVID, that it really kind of put certain people, young people, off tourism in a way that it somehow was so unsustainable as to have any, merit, or indeed not sustainable as a kind of a career. And I do worry that, we really want those young people to come back into study and learn about the industry and learn how to, and increasingly, if you look at our programs in academia, they are critical. So if you look at economists or other, disciplines, maybe they haven't really, rephrased or changed over the last 10, 15 years. But, in tourism programs and events programs, increasingly we do have these conversations around sustainability and spatial and mobility justice in terms of decolonization or decolonizing the curriculum, and
inclusion in general, overall.
Exactly, and equality, diversity, inclusion, and that's it's what I teach every single day. So I think we have a very important role to play in developing these young people as they go work in hotels and work in in marketing organizations and DMOs and various sectors linked to tourism and hospitality. Mm-hmm. So I would love to see, again, our politicians and our business leaders and other important stakeholders, to joining us and to help us, and to create a curriculum or tourism program that's beneficial not just to the students themselves, but to the businesses, to destinations, and of course local residents. And I think that's a great way forward if we start talking to each other and engaging with each other, so that our research has an impact on their businesses or in their strategies, but vice versa, we understand where they're coming from as well.
Right. Well, this has been fascinating, Michael. Thank you. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully, as you do more research, we'll get to talk about it more as you come out with more research on this.
But thanks very much for inviting me, Ali. It's been a pleasure, and I'm a fervent follower of Skift. So
appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
This has been the Skift Podcast. Thank you for listening.